Alright, folks. As I promised, here's the second podcast. Now we are going to talk about loss of keystone species and how loss of keystone species through trophic cascades impact biodiversity within that community or within that particular ecosystem. Okay, now the biggest question is, what is a keystone species? Well, let's forget the species part. And try to understand what is a keystone. Look at this diagram that you see over here. Let me get my pointer here first. Alright, look at this arch over here. Now, where do you see the keystone? Right in the center. In a given arch, how many keystone do you see? Well, actually just one. Okay. Now, what happens if you take out that keystone? The entire arch collapses. Okay, exactly the same thing happens when you mess with keystone species. That is exactly the role you see among keystone species in their habitats, in their ecosystems, in their communities. Now, by definition, let's try to compare a keystone species from an ecological perspective to this keystone in the arch. Well, keystone species in a given community, their ecological role they play in their ecosystem is disproportionately large compared to their abundance. Okay, so in other words, from keystone species you observe a disproportionately large effect on the community, on the ecosystem, compared to relative to their abundance, to their biomass. So this brings up the question, would you expect keystone species to be the most dominant species? Are dominant species always a keystone species? Well, not necessarily. There are many occasions where the non-dominant species, a species with a substantially smaller population size, with a smaller population density, functions as a keystone species. So understand that definition really well. So what do they do? What are these so-called disproportionately large functions? Mainly, it's about maintaining local biodiversity, enhancing local biodiversity, maintaining or retaining a greater biodiversity in that habitat or in that ecosystem. And of course, sometimes it's how they do that. Well, probably by influencing, structuring the community in such a way to enhance the biodiversity within it, to enhance the number of species that can be kept within that particular ecosystem, that can be fed, sustained within that particular ecosystem. Now start thinking how you can achieve these targets. How can you increase the biodiversity as a keystone species? Many different ways, but primarily you are going to observe that keystone species does this or gain this goal by controlling populations of other species that would have otherwise become dominant. So what does that tell you? How can a particular species control populations of a potentially dominant species? Well, the first thing that should come to your mind is by being a predator. Okay, as a predator, you can exert a top-down influence on lower trophic levels and thereby prevent monopolization of certain essential biological resources by a dominant species. So, in other words, a keystone predator can keep a potentially dominant species in check, under regulation. Now you can ask the questions, alright, so are all keystone species top predators? The answer is no. Most often you are going to find yes, but not all the time. Okay, for example, I can tell you an example right now. Look at the elephants. Okay, the African elephant especially can be considered as a keystone species, and it's not a top predator, it's an herbivore, right? It actually does the same function, essentially regulating the emergence or the dominance of certain grasses, bushes and trees, and helps maintain the diverse vegetation structure within savanna and grassland ecosystems. So essentially because of the elephants' grazing habits and their foraging habits, the number of woody tree species in the grasslands can be regulated. And you know what? If the woody tree species invasion cannot be regulated, well, then gradually a grassland or a savanna woodland can be converted into a woodland or to a forest. And if that happens, savannas may not harbor the greater diversity that it does now. So why there are so many why savannas are so diversity rich, particularly in terms of mammals, especially carnivores? Well, you can thank the elephants for that. Well, I want you to think about more examples where keystone species act uh, as a where a particular keystone species plays a role other than being a top predator. So if you're looking at a keystone species that is not a top predator and neither an herbivore, so what are the other possible functions it can perform? Well, you might be looking at a species that is providing essential critical resources. Now, meaning, okay, think about what are so-called essential critical resources. So what if a particular species can serve as food for many other species? Okay, now you're looking at a prey that is that functions as an energy resource for many other species. So that's a possibility. What if a particular species can modify or alter the habitat structure so it enhances the niche dimensions that can be occupied by many other species? So providing habitats is also provision of a critical resource. So think about these ecological concepts and try to come up with yourself examples for keystone species. Well, the evolution of this concept can be traced all the way back to 1960s, when Robert Payne, an ecologist, actually described that sea stars can actually function as a keystone species in the coastal intertidal ecosystems. And now in this case, the top predator, the sea star, is in fact a predator that predates on certain dominant mollusks. So by predating on dominant mollusks, the sea star helps to open up niches or resources that can be colonized by many other subordinate species of invertebrates, mollusks, and many other invertebrates in the coastal environment. And thereby the sea star helps to increase the biodiversity of intertidal coastal ecosystems. That's a very classic research. You should actually, I strongly encourage you to study and read Robert Payne's work. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about two more concepts with relation to keystone species: the top-down control and trophic cascades. Now, these concepts, in fact, enable us, conservation biologists and ecologists, to forecast the potential impacts of removal or addition of one or more species from a given ecosystem within a given food web or a trophic pyramid. So, meaning that these concepts of top-down control and trophic cascades are strictly related to trophic interactions, strictly related to food webs. So first, top-down control. Now this happens when a certain consumer species, mostly a predator, controls the structure of the entire ecosystem through modifying trophic interactions. So think about this control literally from top to down. A consumer or a predator lying on the top of the food chain, lying on the top of a food web, through act of preying, predating and eating, exerts a certain pressure, a certain ecological force that cascades, that passes down to the rest of the trophic levels, to the rest of the for the other links in the food web. Trophic cascades is a very related incidence. By definition, trophic cascades comes about when a top-down regulator, like I just described before, a top-down regulator is removed, or and species is added who can function as a top-down regulator. Okay, so that results in a number of modifications in the ecosystem in terms of biomass, in terms of species composition, in terms of feeding functional groups, in terms of the overall community structure and net primary productivity. Now these are nothing to memorize. You don't have to memorize any of these. Why? Because if you think what comes about by a particular influence on trophic interactions, think about everything that results from that impact on the food chain. Okay, the overall living community, which is biomass, is impacted. Okay, and then certain species can be predated than the other, meaning species community can be influenced, right? If species composition is influenced, you are definitely looking at an altered community structure, altered community composition. And whenever this trophic force, ecological force, cascades all the way from the top to the bottommost trophic level, the primary producers are going to be impacted, meaning the net primary productivity can be impacted. And needless to say, the net ecosystem productivity can be impacted if tropical cascades were to take place. So the bottom line is try to understand the basic concept, and then based on your ecological and organismal biology knowledge, try to broaden your view and try to logically understand the potential impacts of messing up with trophic pyramids. Now let me illustrate how top-down control and tropical cascades work in the context of trophic interactions with respect to keystone species playing the role of being a top-down regulator. So in this example that you are looking at here, you're looking at a particular lake, okay, and that lake naturally had a piscivore population. Now if the piscivore population, now who are piscivores? Well, fish that feeds on other fish. Okay, now with this carnivorous fish increasing in their abundance, they are going to exert a top-down pressure on the zooplanktivorous fish. Okay, zooplanktivorous means fish that feed on zooplankton, right? So with this interaction going on, the zooplanktivorous fish population is going to go down, their biomass is going to go lower. Now with that happening, let's look at what's happening in the next trophic level. Okay, you are looking at zooplankton. Now with the zooplanktivorous fish declining in their biomass, the zooplankton are relieved of predatory pressure, so their biomass is going to increase. Now when what happens when the zooplankton biomass increases? Well, what do zooplankton feed on? Phytoplankton, algae. Okay, so the biomass of algae is going to go down. What happens when the biomass of algae go down? Well, what do they feed on? Well, they actually don't feed, quote unquote. They assimilate nutrients, okay, mainly nitrogen and phosphorus. With the declining algal biomass, you might observe an increased availability of dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus that can be assimilated. Now let's think what happens when humans interfere. Okay, this is a conservation biology class. We are talking about not just ecology, we are applying ecology theory to a conservation context. Let's think about overexploitation of the fisheries resource. Within the spectrum, what organism would humans mostly overexploit? Piscivorous fish, carnivorous fish. So now look at the bottom panel. Okay, with the fisheries industry, we might eliminate or decrease the abundance of the piscivorous fish. Now that relieves the zooplanktivorous fish from the predatory stress, and as a response, the zooplanktivores increase in their biomass. So that increases the predatory pressure on zooplankton. So their biomass decreases. Decreasing biomass of zooplankton relieves the grazing pressure upon the algae and phytoplankton biomass, which increases. Increasing algal biomass may lead to decreasing availability of nitrogen and phosphorus in that ecosystem. Now, when you study, okay, try to think about what's happening over here in terms of biomass at each trophic level, changes in the species composition, changes in the community structure, changes in the functional feeding groups, and changes in the nutrient dynamics within that ecosystem. Think about what would happen to other the general overall water quality with this kind of processes happening with the absence of human influences. Okay, now when I first introduced you the concept of top-down control and trophic cascades, I mentioned it's not only removal of a top-down regulator, introduction of a top-down regulator, can also create this situation. Now think what we just meant, the topic we just covered, invasive species. So introduction of a top-down regulator is actually introduction of an exotic species. So like I kept mentioning, none of these horsemen of apocalypses of the environment are independent from each other. There are very interesting ways where you can link them to one another, and each occasion humans actually drives the link indirectly or directly. Okay, so imagine yourself a natural lake where the conditions are like that was free of a natural carnivorous fish, right? And introduction of a carnivorous fish will result in this situation. So try to go through the process of what could happen if a natural lake like the bottom panel turns out to be something like the top panel, right? Try to understand the changes in the ecosystem dynamics, changes in the community dynamics with the removal or introduction of a top-down regulator. Okay, now I'm going to from here onwards talk about the importance and the role of keystone species and what happens when those are eliminated from the ecosystem based on a case study that comes up from a long-term ecological research done within the Alaskan waters, led by James Estes from the United States Geological Survey. And this research, in fact, is a great way to highlight the importance of long-term monitoring, the importance of long-term research to know more about ecology, our wildlife resources, and conservation. So first, I have to talk to you about the ecosystem that this research was focused on, the ecosystem that was severely impacted upon removal of a keystone species. The ecosystem is kelp forests. Okay, although we use the term forests, these are actually not hardwood forests or softwood forests for that matter. In fact, we are not looking at higher plants at all to begin with. We are looking at an algae, a brown algae, meaning if you don't recall your basic biology, brown algae belongs to the class Phaeophysae, and most of the species in this particular ecosystem I'm talking about belongs to the genus Laminaria, and those are actually large seaweeds. These algae are large seaweeds. They can actually grow about 20 to 30, even more than 20 to 30 feet taller. In certain instances, there are records of those these seaweeds being much taller than 30 feet. And these are algae, and algae are photosynthetic, so kelp forests are highly productive. In fact, one of the most productive ecosystems on planet, one of the most productive ecosystems in the oceanic biome. Well, if a particular ecosystem is highly productive, that means that ecosystem has lots of food to sustain many trophic levels, many forms of biodiversity. Therefore, kelp forests are in fact one of the richest biomes in the world. Now, like in a rainforest, structurally, these seaweed forests also form a very dense thick canopy. So kelp forest in fact is a three-dimensional ecosystem that has been managed and engineered by these ginormous large seaweeds. So rather than me continuing to talk about this, I would rather let in the next slide, if when you navigate to the next slide, it contains a video from Noah that describes the structure, ecology, and the biology of this ecosystem. So I encourage you to listen to that.
Kelp forests can be seen along much of the west coast of North America. Kelp are actually large brown algae that live in cool, relatively shallow waters close to the shore. They grow in dense groupings, much like a forest on land. These underwater towers of kelp provide food and shelter for thousands of fish, invertebrate, and marine mammal species. Kelp are very simple organisms that consist of a holdfast, a stipe, and blades. At the bottom is a root-like structure called a holdfast that anchors kelp to rocks and other materials on the ocean floor. Young kelp must compete for space to settle and grow, as the rocky bottom is...
Let me very generally talk about the kelp ecosystems, and this is in fact a recapitulation of the video, but I just wanted to point out certain important elements from the video. So kelps are underwater forests. These seaweeds grow underwater as a forest, mostly in shallow oceans, and with evolutionary biological research, it's been figured out that the evolutionary history of kelp can be tracked down all the way to Miocene, meaning 33 to 23 to 5 million years ago. 23 to 5 million years ago. Now kelp forests occur, or they grow in cold, nutrient-rich water, and are considered to be most beautiful as well as highly biologically productive marine ecosystems. I mentioned that they occur in cold environments, and usually the temperature in kelp forests on average is less than 20 degrees Celsius. And the overall temperature can range between 6 to 14 degrees Celsius. If you want a Fahrenheit conversion, that's about 43 to 57 degrees Fahrenheit in terms of the range. And they are very well known for very high growth rate. For example, species of the genus Macrocystis and Nereocystis are known to grow as fast as half a meter per day, and where they can actually reach ginormous heights. Certain records indicates that they have grown as tall as 30 to 50 meters. 30 to 50 meters, not feet, meters. Okay, but in average, I mentioned it could be much smaller than that. But 30 to 50 meters, that's actually a sort of an exceptional situation, mostly observed in the two genera that I mentioned, Macrocystis and Nereocystis. So I said that kelp forests occur in cold, nutrient-rich water, and they are found throughout shallow open water of the coastal ecosystems, and occurring in both Arctic and Antarctic oceans. Why those two areas? Because those areas provide colder water throughout the year. Being photosynthetic organisms, kelp requires sunlight for their existence. So therefore, that's why they only occur in certain shallow water realms. They do not occur in deep water. They do not occur outside the coastal environment. So I mentioned the extremity earlier on. So in terms of an average, now globally, as an average, the deepest areas where the kelp has been recorded was 40 meters. Okay, and so as in terms of a range, they are known to occur on average between 15 to 40 meters in terms of water depth. And the kelps actually have a very keen capacity for higher rate of reproduction, and of course, like I mentioned previously, their growth rate is considered to be the highest among plants and plant-like organisms. Okay, now to the study site. Okay, so you can see in this map that these kelp forests are occurring in many coastal waters, in many continents, in Australia, Eurasian regions, Africa, Southern Africa, and South America. So we are going to actually concentrate today for today's case study in this region. Okay, let me do a zoom up of that area. There you go. Now we are looking at the area between the Siberian Plateau and Alaska. Okay, so between Russia and the United States. Especially, we are interested in the coastal ecosystem or the kelp forest ecosystem in this area known as the Aleutian Islands, which is an archipelago of islands that kind of exist as stepping stones between the Alaskan Peninsula and the Siberian Peninsula. Okay, now we're going to talk about the focal animal. Okay, the focal animal of this case study that I'm going to elaborate for the rest of the lecture is the sea otter. Okay, now let's talk about sea otters first a little bit. Okay, as you can see in this picture, it's pretty cute and adorable and seems like shy. And those sea otters are in fact carnivores. Okay, there are two groups of carnivores. Taxonomically speaking, one is the terrestrial group where you have all those cats, and then you have the aquatic group of carnivores, also known as pinnipeds. Now, sea otter is oceanic coastal, meaning it's a marine organism in terms of habitat. But phylogenetically speaking, sea otter is not a marine carnivore. Sea otters are related more to the terrestrial carnivores. In fact, the closest relatives of sea otters includes weasels, martens, minks, badgers, and wolverines, and all of those together makes up the family Mustelidae, which in fact belongs to not to the marine carnivores, to the terrestrial carnivores. And as you can see in this photograph, sea otters are actually social organisms, social species. They live in groups. As you see in this diagram, they love doing this, swimming on their backs. And in order to prevent being float away, they actually hold their hands together when they swim. And actually that actually increases the group interactions. And as you know, when you live in groups, that actually increases your survival, because there's more chance of being vigilant when you're in groups. Now, that's about its basic biology. Let's talk about the theme of sea otters here in this Aleutian Island coastal ecosystem. They are declining in this particular habitat in massive numbers. How much of a decline? It's been recorded according to the long-term ecological research coming from Jim Estes. It's about 90% population decline that has been reported since 1990s. Take a look at this figure that comes from Jim Estes' research. So the data indicates the declining of sea otter abundance as a percentage from 1970s to 2000s based on 4 different islands, and in all those locations we are seeing a dramatic decline that starts around post 1990 period, and then of course going down rapidly. Historically, sea otters have undergone population decline, particularly given to a hunting pressure that was exerted primarily by Russians when Alaska belonged to Russia. The history of the state of Alaska, that was a Russian territory, and then later on Russians sold it to United States. But historically, during the time when Americans bought Alaska, the sea otter populations were decimated for its hide, for the pelt, and as well as for the meat by Russians. But after the Americans owned Alaska, and many conservation efforts were taken place with the intervention of Department of Interior, and within the Interior, with the involvement of United States Department of United States Fish and Wildlife Service, Biological Survey, and today the Biological Survey is known as Geological Survey. So all of these organizations within USGS have supported conservation and management of sea otter. Because of that, the decline suffered post 1970s were accounted for. So whatever going on after 1990s has to be something else. Okay, it should not be any remnants or any aftermaths of historical decline. Now, the question for you is, what could be the reasons for the current decline, and of course historical decline. Like I just mentioned, the historical declines were a result of hunting for flesh as well as for the pelt. Now this is a good time to do a pair share moment. Unfortunately we are not in class, so I want you to do that within yourself. Okay, what could be the potential reasons behind observed population declines of sea otters as it's been observed post 1990s? So as aspiring ecologists, conservation biologists, environmental scientists, I want you to think, on the lines of as to how would you investigate your hypotheses and reasons that you proposed for the observed declining populations of sea otters. Okay, and then I want you to think about, like, okay, if those are the based on the hypothesis you brought up, how would you design an experiment or an observational study in order to collect data support of your hypothesis? I really wish we were in class. This would be a great activity to link your basic knowledge about experimental design, research methods, and then actually to employ that in the context of ecology and evolutionary biology. I in fact want you to take a couple of minutes, think about that, and then of course proceed to the next slide, which might contain some of the ideas that you suggested. So, well, here's my ideas, and here's what I think about those. Okay, primarily, well, the historical fact that resulted in declining sea otter population is hunting. So, but you know now, based on your knowledge, that hunting is not a primary problem here as of today, because of the Endangered Species Act, as well as because of this the Marine Conservation Act enacted by the US government. Hunting is not happening as of now within the Aleutian Islands. So so hunting is not the reason, and primarily the International Fur Seal Trade Treaty, this agreement, actually minimized, if not stopped, the hunting pressure on sea otters. And you may question, wait a minute, it's for fur seal, but the Fur Seal Treaty involves species aside seals. Well, in marine environments, one of the greatest threats known is oil pollution with oil spills. Okay, there are many oil spills that happened in both Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So that is a possible explanation, but that can be ruled out. Why? Well, if if the Aleutian Islands were to undergo oil spills, then there will be oil scum floating in this area. That's one possible situation, in possible observation that you would expect. So during this time, no major oil spills were recorded. There were certain spills happening in this time frame, I think with the involvement of the Exxon Oil Company, but it is unlikely to be the problem in the Aleutian Islands. And if it were the problem, what kind of observations would you make? Oil can actually go into the fur coat of sea otters, and that actually compromises the sea otter's skin's ability, the sea otter's hair's ability to thermoregulate. So with the loss of the ability to preserve heat, the sea otters might suffer from massive degree of hypothermia. Now we are looking at kelp ecosystems, and you know how cold kelp water can get. It can go as cold as 6 degrees Celsius during winter period. Okay, so because of that reason, because of the absence record of sea otters suffering from hypothermia with contamination with oil, or due to the absence of oil spills around the Aleutian Islands, we can rule out that possibility. Well, what about other forms of pollution? It could be something related to deprivation of food. It could be diseases. Okay, in either of those cases, if it is contaminant, lack of food, or diseases, you would expect, but what would you expect? Okay, you would expect primarily toxins to occur in the toxins to occur in the animal tissues, right? You would also expect dead carcasses to float in the sea, for carcasses to float in the coastal areas, for the coastal environment to be filled with otter carcasses, and you would also expect certain presence of certain contaminants within blood or body fluids, right? And if it is food deprivation, you would expect animals starving, and you would never expect to see animals feeding. But there was no the scientists who did these observations long term from USGS found negative for tox screens, and they found no dead animals, no carcasses in the ocean or in the coast. Okay, they observed for many instances sea otters feeding on their favorite foods, and most of the time it is actually sea urchins, and somewhat they also like to feed on clams. So plenty of observations on feeding. Body fluid and tissues turn out to be very healthy. So it's not diseases, it's not pollution, it's not lack of food. Well, then what about reproductive failure due to some physiological or climate driven reason? Well, unlikely to be so, because the observations on healthy reproductive rate, observations on successful mating, breeding, and presence of cubs within these groups of sea otters, well, negated the fact that it could have been reproductive failure. Well, then if you can successfully reproduce, you can argue maybe juvenile mortality, maybe it's higher predation rate on juveniles. Well, no, because there were numerous records of healthy pup populations occurring within the Aleutian Islands. So it's none of these. Well, if it is none of the previous reasons that is likely to occur, then the USGS team with Jim Eastie started thinking about what else could it be. Well, in the Aleutian ecosystems, Aleutian kelp forest ecosystems of Alaskan waters, Alaskan and Russian waters, the sea otters were the top predator. But could it be a predator that actually invaded this environment in the recent past? Okay, could it be a predator that is transiently occupy the Alaskan waters, that plays the role of a top predator, replacing the role of actually not replacing, sort of performing an additional role and putting themselves up in the food pyramid? Could it be likely that there is a novel predator in this ecosystem? Well, now you have to look into the possibilities of the species. So, well, needless to say, the organism, the giant mammal that you see in this image right below the map is the killer whale. Okay, so now killer whales are of course top carnivores. They are top predators in many parts of the oceanic ecosystem, but they were not known to play a role in the kelp forest ecosystems. So in fact, they didn't occur much in the kelp forest ecosystems, except for certain transient populations. So as you see in the map, the yellow areas highlight the overall range and distribution of killer whales, both residential and transient populations. Now, the Alaskan waters and the Aleutian Islands actually overlap. In that area, in the Aleutian Islands, the killer whale range overlaps with the the Aleutian Island kelp forest ecosystem. So there is a possibility that there is some novel interactions going on between the kelp forest food webs and killer whales. So what did the USGS team did? Well, they in fact followed up with observations. They were looking for observations on killer whales feeding on sea otters, and yes, to their surprise, they found the killer whales on numerous occasions within this decadal time. Killer whales started feeding on sea otters. Now, this was a surprise because historically, killer whales were not known to feed on sea otters. Now, this makes the question: if not killer whales, if not sea otters, what do killer whales usually feed on? Well, keep thinking. Okay, now let's talk about a little bit more about the evidence we have to substantiate that the declining populations of sea otters can be attributed largely to increased predation by killer whales. Well, in fact, the evidence we have comes from both the observational as well as experimental studies. In fact, this is a combination of both experimentation and observations, which is actually a great moment to highlight the importance and the usability of experimental design and research methods, the scientific method, to solve conservation-driven, ecology-driven problems. So, in order to test the hypothesis that the declining populations are caused by increased predation, the USGS team did observations on two habitats of the Aleutian Islands ecosystem, a coastal ecosystem. So one is actually from the Clam Lagoon, and another site is the Kurok Bay. Now those two have different, although both are coastal kelp forest ecosystems, they have different habitat structures. Clam Lagoon has a narrow and shallow opening to the deep sea. Because of that, it actually prevents the entry of killer whales into the lagoon environment. So wherever sea otters occurring in the Clam Lagoon is protected by predation, whereas in the Kurok Bay, you are looking at open coastal waters within which killer whales can move back and forth as they please. Now try to apply Clam Lagoon versus Kurok Bay to controlled and manipulated experiments. Well, Clam Lagoon seems like a control, and Kurok Bay looks like a manipulated experiment. So now this is the data that they observed, the USGS team observed in the figure you are seeing on y-axis, number of otters as they counted, by visual observations across, and how that count varies across the year from 1993 to 2000s. Well, you can clearly see in the Clam Lagoon, well, as indicated by dark squares, it's relatively stable. Okay, the population relatively was stable across the year, where the killer whale entry was prevented by the narrow opening. As opposed to that, in Kurok Bay, you see a tremendous declining populations from 1993 to 1997. In addition to the figure you see over here in the handout that has been provided to you, take a look at the figure 4. Okay, the handout is also available through the Moodle from the same folder. You downloaded this PowerPoint. So in that one, you are going to see some interesting observations. Now the same figure appears in the following slide, but before looking at it, let me explain you one thing. The graph that you see in this slide is direct count, direct observations. Now, other than direct observations, they already had radio collared or radio tagged the otters in both populations, in both habitats. So they also recorded data based on active transmittance or radio transmittance from those radio collars, from the radio tags that was attached to the flippers of these sea otters. Now let's see what habitat. Look at here. So the same habitats, the same area, same experiment, but you can see generally the conditions, the population, or the percentage marked otter surviving as seen in the y-axis were relatively stable in Clam Lagoon but declined tremendously in the Kulak Bay. But take a look at again and the dark solid bars in the figure representing Clam Lagoon. Here you see a significant decline in 1996 and 1997, although it is 100% stable from 1995 to 1996. There's a slight decline, okay, across the years, not as tremendous as in the case of Kulak Bay. Now, why is this? Okay, how come sea otters are declining, apparently declining in the Clam Lagoon, which actually prevents predation? So obviously that's not predation, right? Now take a look at the title of, or the title of the y-axis, percentage of marked otters surviving. Now that is coming from radio collars directly. Okay, now radio collars do not last forever. Okay, some of their batteries die, some of them become malfunctioned, some of them fall off, right? And of course there's natural mortality in the population of sea otters. Because of all that, your observations are not going to be the same as the radio collar. So in fact radio collars supports the other data collected by means of direct count, so it cannot be actually considered as a totally independent source of data unless you account for the loss of radio collars, the malfunctioning of radio collars, and of course the natural mortality. So I just wanted to show you how to interpret the radio collar data or radio transmitter data. It's a great way to do research, ecological research, environmental research, conservation research, but unfortunately inherently equipment malfunctions, and so do radio collars. Just wanted to show you that over here. But still, despite that, you can see the declining in the Kulak Bay is tremendous compared to what you observed for the Clam Lagoon. Okay, now the biggest question is, well, those two species have coexisted. You noticed that in a previous map, the range of the killer whales and that of sea otters do overlap, meaning they actually did coexist. But I mentioned earlier that killer whales did not play a role in the food web that sea otter dominated. Okay, but now the question is, all of a sudden, after 1990s, why did this nave-trophic interaction took place? What environmental ecological conditions led to this novel trophic interactions? Well, for that, let's talk a little bit more about killer whales. Okay, what about what they do, how big they are, and what kind of species they predate on. Now let me reserve the site to talk about the size parameters. I will do that in the next slide. So killer whales are what? Mammals. Okay, so aquatic mammals, ginormous aquatic mammals. So they actually feed on a variety of prey involving squid, cuttlefish, many species of fish, seabirds, sea turtles, seals, sea lions, and dolphins. So speaking of their preferred prey, particularly in this part of the part of their distribution in the Aleutian Islands, it's Stellar sea lions and the harbor seals. Again, two species of mammals, in fact aquatic carnivores belonging to the group Pinnipedia. Now, any animal, like any foraging animal, like any predator, killer whales are very selective in their prey. They do that based on the optimal foraging theory. Okay, any predator will actually prey only on species that are abundant enough in the environment with a high encounter rate that will provide them their above basic nutritional and caloric requirements with the minimum expenditure of the energy for the purpose of hunting and food handling. So Killer whales are very fast predators. They are known to swim as fast as 34-35 miles per hour. Um, Killer whale distribution, as you have already noticed, they occur almost globally. They occur from polar regions all the way to the tropical regions. They live in they live in groups. They have group interactions, and those killer whale groups are known as pods. Pod. So there are two distinct types of pods. There's a transient type and a residential permanent type. So the transient type is transient, meaning it's temporary. They can actually dissociate and reassociate, and their territoriality is fairly minimal, whereas the residential populations could be highly territorial. So the transient ones are smaller in size, about 7 individuals. Um, they roam over broader areas. They eat predominantly mammals, and they can also vocalize. You know about the unique mammalian vocalizations. Residential populations are larger. They could be as many as 25 individuals in a given residential pod. Unlike the transient ones, they have smaller home ranges and very defensive and very territorial, and they have a high fidelity to their small range. They mostly eat fish, and they also do vocalize. Now, killer whale pods appear to consist of groups of related individuals, so there's a kinship going on when it comes to group formation. Um, there's very little migration that has been noted between and among pods, and mating is thought to occur when one or more pods come into contact with another. Males and female reach a sexual maturity around 10 to 18 years old, and females give birth to single calves, which associates closely with their mothers for many, many years. In terms of the longevity, killer whales are very, very long lived. They are known to their lifespan for females is going to be about 80 to 90 years, and in terms of males it's going to be about 50 to 60 years. Now the question is, why did killer whales shifted from stellar sea lions to from a predominant diet based on stellar sea lions and harbor seals to sea otters? So, thinking about that answer, that question I just raised, okay, here we are looking at this big killer whale shifting their diets from stellar sea lions and harbor seals to sea otters. Now, this is a huge problem. This is a huge concern. Look at the weight differences, the size differences between Stellar sea lions and sea otters. A Stellar sea lion slash a harbor seal may weigh about between 250 to 300 or 350 kilograms. A sea otter is about what, like 20 to 35 kilograms. Based on male versus female, there are differences, but generally that is the range. So there's a massive, a tenfold size difference. Okay, so now it begs the question: how many sea otters did a killer whale eat in order to satisfy their energetic requirement that previously was satisfied by stellar sea lions and harbor seals? And again, why killer whales shifted in the diets? Well, when you shift in diets based on the optimal foraging theory, the reason could be that the stellar sea lions and harbor seals are no longer abundant. They are not the most profitable. Maybe they are not the most caloric rich or nutrient rich any longer. I mean, if you know about the optimal foraging theory, which describes very eloquently the foraging strategies and foraging activity, foraging behavior of predators, you have to look for the prey that you encountered the most, that provided you with the best and ideal diet that best satisfies your above basal metabolic requirements, metabolic demands. So now let's start looking into the economical dimension, the ecological dimensions and energetic dimensions of this problem. Now take a look at this diagram, the table you see over here. So it tells you the very conservative estimates of energetics and body mass of sea otters and the killer whales. Now I'm going to give you a warning regarding the killer whale weights, biomass provided over here. Those are very conservative, minimal possible estimates. In general, a male killer whale weighs more than 10,000 kilograms, and a female might weigh more than 7,000 kilograms. So those estimates are very low, quite lower than the average possible estimates. Okay, so and probably in this research, the researchers, the USGS team, focused on the not the global averages of the killer whales. They actually focused on the minimal possible weights of male and female killer whales that is roaming in the Aleutian Islands area. So hence this significant difference as you observe, and start thinking what would have driven these significant differences in the weights, and you might figure out the answer quite soon down the road. So like I mentioned earlier, sea otters, a male maybe about 30 kilograms and females little less, about 23 kilograms in weight. And in general, on average, the caloric content of sea otter meat is about slightly less than 2 kilocalories per gram of wet body weight of sea otters. In terms of killer whales, the average metabolic rate of a killer whale is 55 kilocalories per kilogram of a whale per day. Okay. Now, given that caloric requirements of the killer whales, we can calculate how many adult sea otters should a killer whale eat in order to survive, in order to satisfy its basic metabolic requirements. Well, what is the answer? How many otters a day would a male killer whale need to eat? Well, the answer is about 5 male otters per day, right? And if the killer whale was eating female otters requires at least 7 female killer otters per day. Well, our math is not done yet. Now you have to ask the question. Look back at the data. There was a 90% population decline among sea otters. Now what is 90% as a number? About 40,000 otters within a 6-year time frame during the observations of the USGS. Okay, now here's the question. Could the previous math I mentioned account for the number of otters that have disappeared in 6 years? What is the number? 40,000. For how long within 6 years? Well, the answer is it's possible. The answer it has been discovered that it is totally possible, and with the rate of 5 otters per day per whale within 1 year for 6 years, it's a total of 10,950 otters can be consumed by a single whale for a 6-year period, right? And now how many male killer whales, or how many in general, how many male killer whales are required to satisfy that demand? Well, you only require about 4 male killer whales. Now go back to the pods. What is the size of a pod? Well, pods can be can contain about 5 to 6 pod members. So with those transient pods, it's certainly possible that about 4-5 killer whales may have actually devoured 40,000 sea otters within a 6-year time frame. The math proves it's completely possible. Okay, now let's try to understand everything we talked about so far and try to build up like a flow chart regarding, starting from the decreased abundance of food for killer whales. In fact, going beyond that, how come the killer whales suffered from decreased abundance of seals, and all the way towards what happened at the absence of sea otters to the kelp forests. First, well, thanks to the humans, thanks to their love and high demand for fat-rich fish that taste really well, such as perch and herring, the population of fat-rich fat-rich fish declined in the Aleutian coastal ecosystem. Now, what happens with this? Well, you have decreased population and decreased recruitments for this fat-rich fish that have a very high caloric and a nutritional value. Meanwhile, well, humans not only hunted fish, they also hunted whales, baleen whales, which is a planktivorous fish. So their hunting led to their population decline, and ultimately that actually resulted in a competitive release of populations of other plankton feeding fish which have low fat and low caloric fish, such as pollacks, which actually capitalized a lot from these situations, from both of these situations, overfishing and baleen whale hunting. Now ask the question, so what? You have lots of low caloric, low fat fish that doesn't taste really well, and you have lost herrings and perches which usually provide a lot of fat, a lot of nutrients for other aquatic organisms in the food chain. Now, who else other than humans that love fat-rich fish? Well, seals and sea lions. Well, they prefer to devour fat-rich, good-tasting fish, but now they don't have an option. And guess what happens to their population? Seals and sea lion populations went down because they don't have a good energy resource, good fat resource. Instead, they have to deal with this tasteless, shitty pollacks, which doesn't provide the minimum requirements for the seals. So they started to die, and there were reproductive failures of seals and sea lions and lower survival. So ultimately reduced population size of seals and sea lions. Now what happens now? Who feeds on seals and sea lions? I just mentioned Mr. Killer Whale, right? So killer whales now don't have their preferred food, so they had to switch, right? Not only seals and sea lions, they had to switch too. So now they had to seek for other possible mammals? Well, the only thing available was sea otters. You have already done the math and you have looked into their caloric values, their body masses, and you know that sea otters only have little calories to be offered to offer for the killer whales, and to satisfy the demand, metabolic demand of killer whales, they had to eat more and more sea otters. Okay, um, just to give you an approximation, a single adult killer whale may have eaten 2 to 3 adult sea lions, but according to the math we did, for minimal caloric requirements, a killer whale had to eat about 5 to 7 sea otters. So, yeah, so increased culling of sea otters, increased predation of sea otters happened. Now, what happens now? Well, now start thinking, who feeds who feeds on what? What do otters feed on? Well, as most of you have heard through your ecology classes, sea otters' preferred diet is sea urchin, right? And who are sea urchins? Sea urchins are herbivores, voracious herbivores. And what do sea urchins feed on? Kelp forests, right? So, with the death of sea otters due to predation, sea urchins were released from their predator. So they enjoyed the predatory release, and their populations, their biomass increased substantially, and which increased the grazing pressure on kelp forest, kelp vegetation, kelp weeds, and therefore there was a massive declining of biomass of kelp vegetation. Now that ultimately led to a greater alteration of the habitat complexity, the habitat heterogeneity, and many other favorable habitat parameters of the kelp forest ecosystem. And with that massive alteration of habitat complexity, the biodiversity that it harbored previously declined dramatically. Now this is another table from the handout that I gave you, and in fact these are direct research data, published data from Jim Estes' USDS research group. So over here you are looking at the habitat area of the Aleutian Islands with otters present. Here you are looking at the same area, not the same area as another habitat within the Aleutian Islands where otters were absent. Now take a look at this. Okay, over here you are looking at the density of individual different types of kelp species, right? About 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 species, right? Look at the higher density in the presence of sea otters. Why? Sea otters feed on urchins, and so there's few urchins to feed on kelp, right? Look what happens with the absence. Well, the densities of kelp drop to 0 except for a very few instances where you had less than one individual surviving in a given unit area. Now look over here. Look at what's happening to the sea urchin abundance or sea urchin parameters. First, the size. In the presence of sea otters, the test size, diameter. What is test? It is the shell that protects the viscera of the sea urchins, and sea urchins are what? They are a group of mollusks. The test diameter is about 30 millimeters in the presence of sea otters. At the absence, they grew larger, twice as big in the absence of sea otters. Why is it smaller over here? Well, because sea urchins do not let these tests grow. Sea urchins get predated by sea otters during an early developmental stage, during an early growth stage. They don't get this big. The bigger the sea urchin gets, a bigger predator you are going to have on kelp forest, a bigger herbivore you are going to have in the kelp forest with a greater rate of grazing pressure. Look at the biomass. Now the biomass change from here between the absent and present sites. The biomass differences between the sites where sea otters present versus sea otters absent is ginormous, about 9 times more. Right? There are about 9 times more biomass of sea urchins in the absence of sea otters compared to the presence of sea otters. The density of sea urchins is twice as big. In similar situation over here, we are looking at two different sites again within the Aleutian Islands ecosystem. Sea otters absent here and sea otters present over here. Well, look at the impacts on different types of kelp species. While the annuals suffers the least, well, it's not that they received less grazing pressure. It is in fact that annuals can keep regenerating in every season, but perennials on the other hand suffered the greatest. The differences is about 50%, about actually 50 times between the sea otter between the sites where the sea otters were present versus sea otters were absent. And you can also see the huge differences in terms of the sea urchin biomass over here again. Look, almost zero sea urchin density under the existing predatory pressure of otters, and which increased to extremely high densities when the sea otters were absent. To sum it up, let's see what happened over here. Well, in the look at the differences in terms of sea otter abundance, or the relationship between the density and abundance of sea otters and how that corresponds with the biomass density and abundance of sea urchins. And when that happens, what's going on with the kelp density? Well, to sum it up simply, when sea otters are higher in number, higher in density, there's a huge predation pressure or predatory pressure on sea urchins. And when sea urchins are lower in abundance, you are going to have more and more kelp growing over there. Okay, and the reverse happens when you reduce the abundance, when you cull sea otters, when you kill sea otters. Okay, when the sea otters succumbed to predatory pressure from killer whales, right? Under that situation, this is what you are looking at, right? Declining sea otter numbers, declining sea otter abundance, corresponding increment in sea urchins, and corresponding decline in kelp forests, kelp vegetation. It's the same thing I'm showing in a different graphics, just so that you can understand and compare and contrast between different data sets. Want to know the dramatic change that sea urchins can resort to the kelp forest? This is what you're looking at. Okay, this is actually called a kelp barren or an urchin barren. This is what happens to a lush, thick vegetation of kelp forest when the sea urchins, as you can see, increase in their abundance. They keep eating all the kelp forests with the reduced predatory pressure, and out of one of the most diverse, one of the most productive habitats, you end up with almost nothing. Well, just a barren land filled with many sea urchins, and whoever can feed on sea urchins other than sea otters. Well, that's one big example with reference to a case study that I described you, how important keystone species are. And in that example, the keystone species is the sea otter, not the kelp. It was the sea otter, not the kelp, that actually functioned as the keystone species. And you can also argue that the killer whale assumed the position of the keystone species, being a top predator in that particular ecosystem. So what else? What do you want to know about? More examples of top predators being keystone species? Here you are looking at a couple of examples. Jaguars, cats, huge big cats that once roamed the entire South American continent, but now today there are only few isolated populations of jaguars roaming the South and Central America. Most of them are restricted to the Amazon basin and the Amazon rainforests. Unlike many other cats, jaguars actually do not avoid water, meaning that they can even, jump into water and actually predate organisms from water. They are great swimmers, and so rivers actually provide many fish for them in terms of many prey for them in terms as fish, turtles, and caimans. And of course, not to mention the fact that they can also predate on the land. So as a predator, they reduce the population size of the most dominant prey. So controls the prey that can over-dominate, that can actually competitively exclude um, other organisms, and also ensuring that the trophic levels below can also sustain in the same ecosystem. So it's essentially different species also exerting a top-down a tropical cascade mechanism to increase the overall biodiversity of that particular ecosystem. This is going to be a different examples. We are looking at alligators, American alligators. Now, how do they contribute to the ecosystems, and how do they function as a keystone species? And again, alligators are in fact predators. Well, the predation is not the only role they play over here. They kind of act as ecosystem engineers and actually modify wetland ecosystems, marsh ecosystems to sustain higher degree of biodiversity. They can dig deep depressions called gator holes within shallow wetlands with the use of their tails. So because of that digging, it will hold more water during will collect more water during rainy seasons, and for the dry season it will harbor more water, and that habitat will serve as a refugia for many different species of wetland species or wetland specialists. Well, fortunately or unfortunately, alligators do not have very good toilet habits. They are not very well trained, so they poop and pee in the same wetland. Now that's good in fact, because poop and pee are nutrients, phosphates and nitrates, that will actually supply nutrient nourishments for the growth of vegetation, algae, and certain bacterial species that can actually drive trophic interactions that can increase the productivity of the wetland. And like I mentioned earlier, these kind of activities, non-predatory activities, increases the ability for such wetlands to provide refuge habitats for many fish, insects, snakes, turtles, and birds. And yeah, that picture you see to the bottom is in fact a nesting mound, a nest of an American alligator. Now those nest mounds provide nesting and feeding sites for many birds and turtles. So as a predator, alligators actually feed on a number of fish like gore, which helps to maintain the populations of game fish such as bass and bream. So that's actually a keystone species providing benefits for humans. And gator holes and nesting mounds helps. I mean, they're very tall, huge, ginormous structures. So these structures actually help to keep invasive species away, keep wetland environments free of invasive species and invading vegetation. So that's a number of roles performed by a single keystone species in the wetland environment. Another Pasha moment for you. So take a look at these questions. Other than top predators, what are some other examples for keystone species? I actually raised this question at the very beginning of the lecture. Now I am reminding you of that. Can you think about herbivores that can function as a keystone species? I gave you one example at the beginning, the African elephants. And what are some other roles played by keystone species aside from top-down control? Think about it. I just gave you an example with respect to the American alligator and how they enhance the productivity and the biodiversity of wetland ecosystems. Alright, I'm going to give you a couple of examples. This is salamanders, right? And or rather you can say amphibians, that can be considered as a keystone species. In temperate forest floors and headwater streams and vernal pools, in the both in the tropics and especially in the eastern temperate forests, they account for a greater biomass. Now you may tell me, wait a minute, that's a huge biomass. That's nearly that's way above 50% of the overall biomass of animals. So how come a particular taxa with that much of biomass be considered a keystone species? Shouldn't they have a lower abundance? Wait a minute. Take a look back at the definition. It's not simply having a smaller abundance or smaller biomass, it's having ecological functions that is disproportionately high compared to their biomass. So that's the case in terms of salamanders and frogs, or in the case of amphibians. Now, what are their functions? They play a huge role in food webs. Now, they are not top predators. In fact, because there are avian predators, there are mammalian predators in the headwater streams, vernal pools, and forest floor that actually can feed and eat amphibians. So, they function as a food source, as a prey base for many other species, and not to mention about the fact that certain reptiles can also feed on many species of amphibians. So they also have a biphasic life cycle, you know that already, where they actually spend their larval stage in water and spend their adulthood on land, and of course adults move back and forth to water and back to land for different requirements, and some of them include behavioral thermoregulation and foraging, and of course reproduction. Given this complex life cycle, they actually bring energy and matter, nutrients back and forth between the riparian landscape and the aquatic habitat. So they actually function, they mediate the food web dynamics as well as nutrient cycle dynamics. I mentioned the fact that they are a prey base and they are also predators. As adults, they feed on many invertebrates, and as larvae, when it comes to frogs, tadpoles are grazers, are herbivores that feed on algae and periphytons within the aquatic environment. So next, one of the cutest keystone species ever, as you can see in this image, these are prairie dogs, right? Prairie dogs are herbivores. They contribute greatly to these grassland environments. They are largely plain species, grassland species. They, through their foraging activities, they actually provide a lot of nutrients to the plains ecosystems by enhancing the richness of nutrients in the soil and water. Those are burrowing rodents, so burrowing itself in fact sort of recirculates or mixes the nutrients within the soil, and they live in colonies. In fact, they are social organisms, social species. They largely occur in the central and the western North America in the prairie grasslands, hence called prairie dogs, and the burrows they construct are known to be utilized by many other species that occupy grassland ecosystems. So their foraging activities retains water in the soil, and the feces that they provide back to the soil adds more nutrients, organic matter to the grass, which can be recycled by the nutrient assimilation activities by grasses and decomposers. And because of this foraging activity, where they feed on the grasses and then poop on the grass and the grass regenerates, you are going to have an abundance of younger grass that are highly palatable, that provide more nutrients for many other mammals like bison and elk. So thereby they recruit more and more mammals to that ecosystem, thanks to their grazing activity that keeps regenerating younger, palatable, nutrient-rich grasses. One more thing, what is that? Black-footed ferrets, an endangered species in the United States of America. Now these ferrets actually feed on the prairie dogs. So prairie dogs are not only something that are not only just herbivores that actually keep grasses growing and keep the nutrient cycles going on and hydrologic cycles going on in grassland ecosystems. They serve as a food base, a prey base for one of the most endangered mammals in the United States.